Bayside Folsom, good morning. It is so good to be here with you this morning. Some of you know this. I got off a flight last night at 1:30 a.m. I sent in the slides for this message at 3:10 a.m., and I don't have any filter left. So we're just going to let it rip today. If you're new here, my name is Brannon, Shortt, and I get to be the... And I get the honor of being the co-lead pastor here at Bayside Folsom. But I'm going to dive right in today. There I was on a Tuesday afternoon in the nursing mom's room. Like, Brannon, what the heck were you doing there? I'm glad you asked. Here's what I was doing. So we called it the nursing mom's room at one time. Now it's called the cry room. But if you remember all the way back in the day, in the nursing mom's room, it was the only place on this campus that had a recliner. And if you remember, that recliner was the only place on campus you could lean all the way back and put your laptop there. So there I was on a Tuesday afternoon. I usually didn't go in there while moms were nursing, so I waited till Tuesday, go in there, got my laptop on my lap, working, got my legs kicked back, and I get home and do what many of you have done. I'm panting around my pants trying to figure out where my AirPods are. Anybody ever ripped your house apart looking for AirPods or headphones? I've literally lifted, I literally lifted a couch once trying to see if it was in the very bottom. I cut the thing on the bottom of the couch in order to look, and they weren't there. So the next day, I walked into our nursing mom's room looking for my AirPods, thinking they probably fell out of my pockets while I was sitting on that little chair. So I reached down into the right crevice of the chair, and I felt it. Now you're like, what is it? Because that chair was pretty, gross. You would sit in it and it would crunch. A little bit of breast milk, a little bit of throw up, a little bit of baby fluid, a little bit of spit up, a little bit of yogurt, all on one little seat, So you'd sit in it and it would crunch. So I reached my hand down into that crevice, but I felt that smooth AirPod case. Pulled it out. Couldn't use them, though, because they were dead. Go home, charge them up, put them in my ears, but it didn't quite feel right. You ever had that moment? And then it looks on my phone and says, are you trying to pair with Joe's AirPods? And I was like, I'm pretty sure this is how you get diseases. The wax, and you look in on me, you're like, oh. So it's Joe's AirPods. Joe, you still haven't picked up your AirPods, but they were in that chair. I go back in the next day thinking, I still think my AirPods are in that chair. So I reach down into the left side and feel an AirPod case. Pull it out, but they're not the same generation as my AirPods. So I try to connect to it and it said, these are Melissa's AirPods. I'm like, what in the world? So then if you will, I reach down the back crack of that chair and there's another one. I pull it out and they're my AirPods. Brannon, what is your point? Here's my point. As humans, we tend to lose things in the same places. We tend to lose things in the same places. We're not that hard of a species to figure out. I can't tell you how many people that I've seen lose themselves on the same road of greed that countless others before them lost themselves. I can't tell you how many people I've seen lose their purpose in the same prison of fear that they promised they would never let house them. I can't tell you how many people I've seen lose their integrity in a seat of power. But where I've seen more people lose themselves and lose their way and even lose their faith is sitting on a seat called suffering. There's no denying it. So many of us, all of us will lap that road. We'll go through suffering, we'll go through pain, and we'll go through loss. And there's this great temptation to lose ourselves there. A lot of us lose ourselves in that same seat. And yet it doesn't have to be that way, but I don't want to be callous this morning either. This series is called The Problem of Life. How dishonest would it be if we talked about the problems we face in life and didn't touch suffering, pain, and loss? How disingenuous would that be? There's no one in here who hasn't suffered, and there are many in this room who sit in the quietness of your own seat, and you're suffering far more than the person beside you would dare to think that you are. But I contend with you this morning that while suffering, we have to hold this, that suffering was not God's will. God didn't put us in the garden to suffer. We have to hold that God is no doer of wrongs, that what has been done to you and what you have done to others and what you have reciprocated or been a part of, that God was not doing those things, that God is a God who the Bible says both sings and weeps. It's why Charles Spurgeon, who they called the Prince of Preachers, said it like this: God is too good to be unkind, and he's too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, meaning when we can't figure out the whys, when we can't trace his hand, we must trace his heart. I contend with you this morning that suffering will shape you. The question is not if it does. The question is how it does. And I contend with you that your soul can be deepened by it. That you can be stronger, if we could say words like that. I mean, again, not to be callous at all. There's a difference in this medium. If me and you sat one-on-one and you were going through a season of suffering, I would not look at you and give you 40,000-foot answers. So I want to give the asterisk today that there will be some of that because this medium is not one-on-one. This is 1-on-600. So in a room like this, we're going to keep 40,000 while being empathetic. It'll be a little different than the message we preached last year in the Skeptics series that you can find on our YouTube channel if you want to hear it. But hear me today. If you're one-on-one with somebody in suffering, remember, being an answer meal is not the answer. Being present is. But I contend that you can be deepened in pain. That your pain isn't worthless. That it wasn't God that did it, but it is God who uses it. And that he can transform it. And we can come to the other side of things. Albert Camus said it like this, that it was in the depth of winter that I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer. So I don't know where you're at. I don't know if it's winter. I don't know if in this season of your life you're suffering or in pain, but I want us to actually hold the possibility that within us there's more, that we can go deeper, that we can be stronger, that we can be transformed, maybe even more resilient than we were, more compassionate, more refined and wise and rooted, surrendered, and if I could push this even one step further, forgive me, even more hopeful. That on the other side of suffering, there could actually be even more hope. Now, you may be in the room today being like, I didn't come to church on Super Bowl Sunday to hear about this. I came here to talk about how the refs are throwing the games and the Chiefs are going to win and there's a script. Okay? Say there is. Go Eagles. But it's universally applicable. It's part of our story. But you may be new today and saying, what are you talking about? Nah, cut the bull snot. Cut that. What are you talking about? Suffering leading to more hope. You do not know what I've been through. And you're right, I don't. You don't know what I've lost. You're right, I don't. And I'm sorry that you did. And I'm sorry that I did. And just for the sake of saying it, whatever you're thinking about, I believe you. I believe you. But your story didn't end and doesn't end where suffering starts. You say, Brannon, how could you say this? Because the words that have rung from ancient doorways on. Romans, how can I say that? Because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character. And character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. If we are taking this at its most core value, if we're boiling it all down to one thing, if we're studying syntax and Greek and sentence structure, what I see here is suffering and the sentence ending with hope. That somehow, in the midst of it, The banner that flies over our pain is that even suffering ends with hope. Thus today, Bayside Folsom, I would like to travel down a road that is rarely traveled, through a story that is rarely studied, and to a person who is often forgotten. And it's amazing. She's often forgotten, and yet she's the one who in the Bible, to my recollection and knowledge, displays maybe the clearest way through the valleys to the deeper places. And thus we can't afford to miss her story. This woman's name is Naomi, housed in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth in the average American Bible is 4 pages long. In a Bible that is 1,200 pages long. Hear me today. That means her story is only 0.3, not 0.5, not 0.5%, not 1%. Naomi's story is 0.3% of the entire Bible. And hear me today. If her story doesn't happen, none of us are here. None of us. So as we dive into these pages today, would we open our heart to see the things that they display in the valleys to the deeper places? Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, but only the first half says the words, in the days when the judges ruled. Now you have to pause there. We got to do a Sunday morning seminary class just for a second, because if we miss the context of those words, so much of the story gets missed. So much of the gravity of it, so much of the real lifeness of it gets missed. Leading up to this moment in history, there's the people of God called Israel, and they've been charged to live differently, and in so doing, show the world what God is like. They have a beautiful calling on them as a people, but it's not just beauty. They're broken. In the time that the judges ruled, the judges are regional military political leaders. And many scholars say that the fact that the Bible ever says the words in the time that the judges ruled depict one thing on behalf of the people of God: total failure. There's a point in the Bible where God says, you really want a king. You want a king. You want a broken, fallen ruler. You want military, political leaders. Would you not just let me be king? And he says, but I've seen your hearts, so I'll give you what you want. You want power. You want prestige. You want people to fight for you, but in ways that God doesn't seem to fit the bill for you, so he gives them what they want. So when the rulers are judging and the judges are ruling, one scholar says it's the most disturbing, violent, dangerous, murderous time in the history of Israel to that point, where a lethal dose of all the things I just said, along with sin, oppression, and violence, is the scene of the day. So for a woman in that day, in particular, it wasn't 2025. In that day, a woman was uniquely vulnerable in that day. But Naomi's being born into a world she doesn't get to choose. She's being born into a world where the Bible says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That it had led to destruction and chaos and death and backstabbing and turning on one another, questioning every day in the land if something was going to happen. Nothing at all like our world today. And this is where Naomi's born. Before her name is ever mentioned, those 7 words cast the scene of what real life is in the middle of a mess, in the middle of a world, in the middle, far from Eden. And none of us get to choose it. None of you got consent in being born. None of you got to choose what situation you were born into. None of you got to choose the world and its condition on the day that you were born, nor will you get to choose it on the day that you die. There's just a reality in which we are found in. So that's hers in the day when the judges ruled. But let's take it up a notch. There was a famine in the land. So not only is it the most murderous time in history, people are starving. People can't eat. People are likely in this moment dying and fleeing. So much so that it says, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Bayside Folsom, take it up a 3rd level. It's the worst time in Israel's history. People are starving, and now this family becomes refugees in Moabite land who are enemies of Israel politically. Who chooses this? The suffering that is between the lines, we're not even to the second verse. This is one verse in. And then in verse 2 it says the man's name was Elimelech. His wife was Naomi. And the name of her two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Just let that sit in. Married women in the room. He dies. And she was left with her two sons. Could you imagine? At least the gift of them, what our marriage brought together, is here. In the midst of my mourning, I see his face in both of theirs. They married Moabite women. One named Orpah, worst name in the Old Testament, and the other named Ruth. After they lived there for 10 years, though, both of her sons die. And Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So can we just make sure we don't miss this? That we don't get lost in the first set of verses? That just so we don't get lost, people are starving to death. So much so that they flee to neighboring countries to survive. Though it means leaving everyone and everything in the culture that they had known and loved, they move into an enemy camp. Then your husband dies, and then the only way you see your husband in the face of the people you love most, your kids, both of them die. And by the text, it's the only two kids you've got, leaving you alone in a world, and your daughter-in-laws alone in the world as mourning widows in the midst of the most dangerous, disturbing, violent time in history. That's a heck of a first 5 verses. Which means we got to hold point 1, which is simply this, that pain and suffering are part of the human experience. They just are. There's not an escapableness. We can't escape things like suffering and pain and loss. And while life and suffering are unfair in general, maybe the most unfair part about them is that you can't see them coming. And if we were going to just douse a little bit more unfair on the fact you can't see them coming, there's a mystery with suffering that I don't know how to articulate and get my mind around. Maybe you would have better words than me on this. But there's a mystery with suffering. And maybe it's because we're acutely aware to pain, so we're more aware of other things. I'm not sure what it is. I just know this, that when you're in pain and suffering and loss, it seems like when it rains, it pours. It seems like at times it just keeps raining. It just keeps raining. For Naomi, it just keeps pouring. Have you ever been there? Where it didn't feel like the sky would break to dawn. I have a friend like that in a situation right now. This is Carlos Whitaker, lives in Tennessee. And Carlos posted this last night, and if you look in his wife's eyes, you can see remnant of tears, faces that are tired. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but if I read you the whole caption, the first thing it said was Nani's house burned down in Altadena 2 weeks ago. And then my wife's mom died the next week. And then my dad died last night. Sometimes when it rains, it just feels like it pours. Your family members lose their house. Your wife loses her mom. And then out of nowhere, you lose your dad. And at the bottom of the post, it said these beautiful words. He said, people keep asking how we're doing, which is a fair question. And I keep telling them these two things. We're more bruised than we wish we were. It feels like we're in a boxing match with life, and it just keeps punching. And I wish there was more time between rounds. We're more bruised than we wish we were. And listen to this. And we're stronger than we should be. That's the image. That's the image of a believer's hope in pain. That we are not broken and crushed without hope. That though we are struck down, we are not destroyed. That we are not those who don't hold hope in the midst of pain, even in the moments that pain is all we can see and hope is not something we can feel. The image that he painted in an Instagram post was that we would be those who were bruised and strong. Stronger maybe even than we were before. You have no idea, friends. I don't know what you're going through today, but I can promise you this. You do not know how it's going to end. You don't know. I don't know how it's going to end. Naomi, in this point in her story, has no idea how her story ends or if this is the end of her story. All she knows is everybody that she really ever loved is gone and she's still living. And to come to stronger and yet bruised, or what the Bible says is walking with a limp, but yet with your chest high, it's going to take a few really specific things in her story. And the first is a mindset. It says in chapter 1, verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to go home from there. Pause for a second. I cannot imagine that as a wave of emotion. Don't read this like a fairy tale. Imagine it was you. The people closest to you are gone. You're far from home. The home's being depleted. People are starving and there's no food. So much grief has been in your years. And to come from lands and lands away is this song of news that God has provided for his people in the midst of such terrible times. The second point is that mindset that we must remember that God is working and that seasons never last. The seasons never last. You are people, we are a church who sings songs with lyrics like, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. And can we acknowledge, how does God bring food in that day? Most likely, rain. Rain. That he's going to end famine with rain. The first thing he's going to do to restore and redeem Naomi's pain in the midst of her suffering is bring rain to her home. Sometimes we miss that the redemptive moments in our story are easy to miss because we miss that they could be as small as rain drawing us back home. We miss sometimes in the redemptive arc of what God may be doing, the fact that rain is bringing us home and that even in the rain, God is working. And I don't say God is working to make light of your current season or to make light of mine. The truth is you can only experience where you actually are. So when we say that, and Christians, can I just give a little bit of like helpful, pastoral, hopefully wisdom in this? If you're with somebody who's really, really, really going through hell, probably best not to look at them and say, hey, listen, God is working. That make any good Christian want to sock another Christian. Take out some teeth. Pretend like you don't know Jesus anymore and go to town. That is a horrible way to minister to people. You do not need to do that. We'll get to this more in a moment. You just need to be present with people where they actually are, where they're actually at. I again acknowledge this is a different medium than one-on-one. So in this, I risk, even for those of you who are suffering, saying the words that God is working even in the most minute things that you may not have seen him working in. And that seasons don't last. They don't last. That's the hardest thing about seasons, because some of them are really joyful, and they don't always last either. Seasons come and go, but if you are in the throngs of pain right now, this is not where the story ends. Cling to the hope that there are other days. I was on that flight for a long time last night. So I saw another Instagram post. I've never shared an Instagram post with you guys, but those two struck me last night. Carlos's and then Kayla's. Now, I do need to give a little bit of a trigger warning here, though I deal with this very sensitively. Kayla's story involves a husband who completed a suicide while he was the senior pastor at a church down in Southern California, about 10 miles from where we were leading a church in Southern California. And the first words of this post that she posted of Andy 6 years before, the first words are 6 years ago. 6 years ago. And if you read down further into the thing, to the caption, you could hear her heart in those words, because what she has left now is the memory of somebody she really loved. The grief of a process that too many of us in this room, myself included, have had to process. And then 3 little boys. And Kayla said this in the process. She quoted an author and then used her own words. And the quote of the author was this: "If you're looking for the light, don't run west." And she wasn't making a statement about California. She was making a statement that when you're running west, you're always chasing sunsets. And that even when you get there, the sunlight's going to dip. Better in the moments of our life to run east through the dark, being brave enough to go through it, knowing that eventually on the other side of running east, the sun will rise. And she put in that post, she said, because light does what light does. And over these last 6 years, I've ran east into the dark. And though, of course, she still remembers Andy. Of course, there's a love for him. Of course, she sees his face and their kids. And she said, but light will do what light does. One day, it breaks through the clouds. And God will do what God does. Because seasons never stay exactly the same. It doesn't mean you're not marked by the loss. It doesn't mean you're not marked by suffering. It doesn't mean you don't walk with a limp. It doesn't mean you don't have to wear a cane when it comes to your inner soul. It just means where you're at in the moment is not where you will always be, even when that's hard to believe while you're sitting there. That God is working in small things like rain. And run into the reality, because one day the light breaks. There are new seasons coming, friends. There's some of you in here right now, and I know some of your stories. There are seasons ahead of you, and you've come way too dang far to stop now. You come too far to quit. Light will do what light does. And as there are a circle of seasons in every year, so there are a cyclical circle of seasons in every life. So in Naomi's story, Ruth and Orpah plan to head into this next season of life. And Naomi, for the good of those 2 women, says, you shouldn't go with me. My life is equivocally over. All the protection I had in society died with my husband, and any other chance I had died with my kids. You're both young women. You should go back to the land of your mothers, be with your family, rest after a season of pain, and maybe you can start over someday. It says these words in chapter 1 again. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept out loud together. And then look at this. Not only did she say goodbye and they wept, painting that relationship, it says, but Naomi said, return home, my daughters. These are Moabite women from a different people group in the world who are not part of where she came from, but the family tie, the togetherness, the love has brought them closer and brought them into family. But Ruth, Orpah, actually does go back home. And thank God she does. We don't have to hear her name again in the entire Bible. But then Ruth replied with these words, don't urge me to leave you. Listen to this. This is the most gangster, thug, gang member thing we see in the entire Old Testament. Ready for this? Don't urge me to leave you and turn my back from you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I'll die, and there I'll be buried. And may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death can separate me and you. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went until they came to Bethlehem. Point number 3 today is this. The strongest relationships any one of us is ever going to have is going to be birthed in the messes of life. The strongest relationships And the relationships we need to be strong on the other side of our pain are going to be birthed in fire. So I had to ask you today, in the quietness of your own seat, do you have them? Do you have those people? There's a couple on the front row, and she just tapped this guy's leg and kissed him. She's got it. Do you? Do you have these people in your life that are with you no matter what, that would go as far to equivocally say, hey, listen, God have mercy on me. Death ain't even getting between you and me. I'm with you all the way home. We just had Unleashed with all of our high school students at all of our campuses, and we look out at them and challenge them and say, it is impossible to cultivate the character you desire ignoring the company that you keep. And we say that to teenagers all the time. Adults, it is the same for you. You got a group of people that would carry you through fire. That when you look at them and say, my life's over, this is it. There's not hope on the other side of this. Everything I could have really ever loved is gone. Who say, well, I'm not leaving. Where you go, I go. Your God's my God. I'm with you all the way home. Who would cry with you when you ain't got nothing left but tears. When we cry with you when you don't have tears left to cry. I've had people in my life hold me up in that season. I've had people hold me up in that season where walking in the church didn't feel easy anymore. Where lifting my hands in worship felt impossible, and they stood right there with me. Listen, I need those folks. And if you don't have them, I don't say all that to shame you, but I will challenge you with this. In my experience, the way you get those people is you become them. You get them by being there. You get them by being that type of friend. You, in that regard, attract what you are. And the strongest relationships that you'll ever have, that I'll ever have, are those that have both fracture and we had to repair them, that have both beauty and brokenness, that have been forged in the fires of life, and they are essential. They're essential to the fact that we are bruised but stronger on the other side where our souls are deepened. So Ruth stays with Naomi, and when they get back to Bethlehem, there's a passage here that you could so easily read over, and I think it's actually the make or break for you, for me, and for Naomi's life. And it says this: when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Remember, they're going back home. Naomi remembers, and the people there remember her. She fled with her people in famine while people were dying, while there was nothing. And she's coming back feeling like she's got less than when she left and had nothing then, because the people are gone. And she said, "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Don't call me by that name anymore, because that name meant pleasant or full of pleasant moments." She said, "Don't call me that anymore. Call me Mara," a name in Hebrew which means bitterness. Call me bitter, because God, the Almighty's, made my life very bitter. And I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me what you used to call me? I read those words, and honest, I feel them viscerally. I feel them in my body. I feel her pain of being like, here's everybody excited I'm coming back. But what they don't get is I'm not who I was then. I'm more jaded than I used to be. I got more bruises than I used to have. I'm more beat up than I wish I could admit. Don't call me that anymore. I'm not who I was when you saw me last. And a lot of churches would shame her for that statement. And I'm not just here bashing churches. I'm just saying some of you grew up in churches where the line would have been, have faith. Do you not get that the rain came? And people that were starving aren't starving anymore? Do you not get, Naomi, that this is good news? Eventually, you got to get up and get walking again. You just got to walk up that hill. You got to do it. You got to do it. And I'm just, miss me with the do it stuff. If we're really going to come to the other side of suffering in a way where our soul's deeper, we're going to have to be brave enough to be honest. I think what Naomi says here is commendable because it was honest and she meant it. Friends, can I just say this? It is so much easier to be kind if you remember that everybody around you is hurting. It'll be easier for you not to use the universal finger of displeasure on the freeway if you remember the person that cut you off is still hurting. It's still in pain. Everybody around you is hurting. So we ought to clothe ourselves with empathetic love. And I find it interesting that in the Bible, there's no recorded response. Her friends don't go, don't call you that. That's your name. Stop being silly. Oh, no, you're being over dramatic. Oh, no, I think you're just kind of lost in it. It doesn't record a response because the Bible is real enough to actually leave the moment where it really is, highlighting where the honesty actually dwells. Friends, if you got friends in pain who are in the throngs of suffering, the larger the hurt, the less words you need to use. I've said this to you before. You will heal more people with your 2 ears than your 1 tongue ever will. You just need to be present. I think about when Lazarus dies. Jesus shows up knowing good and well that the family is suffering and that he's going to end it. That he's going to raise Lazarus. And the shortest verse in the entire Bible is recorded. Jesus does not show up when they look at him in his face and say, Jesus, where were you? Because if you would have been here. He doesn't look at him and go, have faith, I'm here now. 2 words are recorded. Jesus wept. The greater the hurt, the less words need to be spoken. Your 2 ears will heal more people. And sometimes weeping with those who weep is the greatest way to healing. Be present to those who are in pain. But if you're the one in pain, be brave enough to be honest. I do not believe you or I are coming to the other side stronger if we're lying about it. If we're dishonest about what's going on. How in the world do people bear burdens they don't know exist? And thank God Naomi's not an American, because she would have lied about it if she was one of us. They would have said, oh, Naomi, girl, how are you? And she would have been like, good, how are you? We've been conditioned, friends, in our culture to lie to everybody that asks us that question. But pet peeve, I don't know which one of us is lying. The person being dishonest about their experience or the person pretending to care. We're conditioned for shallow, conditioned for surface, and she dives into the deep with the bravery to be honest about where she's actually at. David does the same. Paul does the same. Esther does the same. The woman at the well does the same. Are you brave enough to be honest about it? And honestly, if it's between me and you, I don't actually care how it comes out. Again, I got off a plane at 3 a.m. last night. I got no filter left. I would rather hear you honest, error-filled, cuss word laden, passionately real every day than hear a Sunday school sounding answer you're using to avoid your reality that smells like pretending. Give it to me. Tell God, I have a kid in this church right now going to hell. And the one bit of advice, only one, because again, it's better to be present, that I gave him was this. I want you to talk to God as honest as you feel it. Because I don't know how this ends. And neither do you. But here's what I do know. If you're that honest, you'll know on the other side of this that with you and God, nothing's ever off limits. And that there needs to be somebody else that you trust that knows everything. Somebody that's inner circle trust that's going to ride with you. You need a Ruth that's going to be there through it all. You may need a therapist every Thursday at 11. You may need all of that. But hear me. Be brave enough to be honest. It's interesting in the Bible that those brave acts of honesty seem to be the keys that unlock the door to destiny. It's interesting that it seems like the whole story hinges on whether or not somebody's actually honest with where they are and then receives what God is bringing to them in His presence, in His closeness, in His word, but in the rain and people He's brought to them. You never know what's on the other side of pain, but I'm telling you, you're never going to be, and I'm never going to be who we are trying to pretend these things aren't real. We have to be honest. The fifth point is this. We quite literally have to know that God weaves redemption through the ordinary. I can't read you the next 3 chapters of this book. Can't. Read it on your own time. But here's the synopsis. That it's simple acts of faith. That it's everyday choices and unexpected kindness that God uses to work this to redemption. That in those words and in those chapters and verses, scholars believe this is about the next year of Naomi's life. Naomi starts in that place of despair, bold enough to be honest. Don't even call me that because I'm not who I used to be. Believing her story is over. And yet God is working things to redemption. Ruth is faithful to Naomi and faithful to go out and work. And there's a man named Boaz who is kind to them. And Ruth goes out loyal and gleans from the fields of Boaz, who's a kind and generous man. And Naomi recognizes that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, which is a legal status and holding in that time of a close relative responsible, listen to this, for restoring a family's name and inheritance by marrying a widow whose husband has died, redeeming their land, protecting vulnerable family members, and symbolizing God gave this to them to symbolize His plan and work of redemption. So Naomi subtly starts to shift from lament to see what God may be doing and may be turning towards redemption. And in an act of bold faith, Ruth pursues and goes to Boaz one day. Under the wisdom and guidance and advice of Naomi, he responds with grace. Boaz redeems Ruth and Naomi. He marries Ruth, and then they have a son one day. But before we get to that verse, we have to pause. Do you see how God redeemed this? Through utterly ordinary stuff. Famine ends with rain. They travel and are honest. Ruth goes to work every day. Naomi is intelligent and inquisitive and gives good advice. Boaz is kind. They understand the relationship. There's love in the mix. Normal, everyday stuff is most of the time how God redeems broken things, broken situations. And that's why it's so easy to miss it until you're looking backwards. So I have to ask you, in your story today, what are the little things you may be missing? What are the little things I may be missing that God is working about for redemption's sake? The verses say this. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive. And she gave birth to a son. And the women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord." And then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." Final point today is simply this, that it's God's heart to restore what has been lost. That does not mean that Naomi forgets to other people that she's lost. It doesn't denigrate the memory of her sons or her husband. It's none of that. It's that God is also working things together in the midst of pain. But it's not just that baby that's lost being redeemed. Think about the other things that were lost that were brought back. One, yes, for sure, people have died and now there is new life. But there was loneliness that found new homes. That there was a family desolated that had been legally redeemed. That there was brokenness and restoration had been tasted. That Naomi in one passage says, "God has crushed me." And later in the story says, "Praise be to God." That in Jesus' words, his plan is to renew, to make new, to make right the things that have been broken. God's heart's on display in the book of Joel. In one sentence in chapter 2, he says, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust have eaten. Is there a direct context to Israel? Yes. But the overall ethic in this of God's heart is simply this. It is the heart of the Father to restore years to us that have been lost in ways maybe that we didn't see coming. It was August of 1943 when the Allied leaders bombed a number of Italian cities, including Milan. And most historic churches and buildings were either destroyed or severely damaged, including the Santa Maria della Grazia. And on the 15th of August that year, a high-powered bomb struck the Santa Maria della Grazia, virtually demolishing the church. The roof caved in, the cloister collapsed, and the entirety of the walls were blown out. The situation was so bad that Dean Keller, the Yale professor who led the Monuments Men, the team of American soldiers whose mission was to protect artwork from the Nazis, wrote several letters expressing his concern for a particular painting that he assumed to be in ruins. But much to their surprise, when the workers removed the rubble of that broken down church, as they removed it over months and articles of time were taken out, they noticed that there was one wall still standing. And if the roof would have collapsed inches closer, the final wall would have fallen. And the painting they were looking for would have been gone forever. But then one day, in dust with light coming through dust particles, they got to the wall to see that the painting was fully intact. And that painting was The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Brannon, what's your point? That you don't know that there's not beauty in the rubble. That there's beauty in the brokenness. That you don't know that the beauty in the rubble is actually what will be the centerpiece of what is to come. Can I tell you this? For Naomi's story, this is the final verse. And they named that little baby she held Obed. And he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, who generation upon generation upon generation would be the father of Joseph, who would be the father of Jesus. You get Jesus because Naomi doesn't quit, because Ruth doesn't quit, because suffering doesn't get the final say. Naomi's going to be the surrogate great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus, of Christ, the Redeemer of the world, the Prince of Peace, the giver of hope, the one in which you and I then have peace with God through, because Naomi pressed forth. I do not know where you're at, but you came too far to stop. There's both beauty in the brokenness. Yes, there's suffering, but don't let your suffering be the one thing that defines you, but let it be one thing that does refine you. The redemption in the Bible is not just possible, but promised. That with God, there's beauty from ashes. There's purpose in pain. And there's legacies from loss. That Jesus was the suffering servant who put on display that suffering could mean redemption for us all. For the whole world, that one day there is no suffering anymore because the suffering servant took suffering on so that one day suffering ceases. So pain and suffering are part of the human experience. God is working and seasons don't last forever. We need strong relationships to get to the other side, and they're birthed in the messes of life. We have to be brave enough to be honest. We have to notice the ordinary because it's in that God is weaving redemption. And it is always God's heart in some way to restore what was lost. Would you pray with me? Father, everyone's hurting. So would you grant us your presence, that we would know that you are with us as we go? If there was somebody that didn't believe in Jesus and the message that you then took on the brokenness to end it, and we can know you and follow you because you rose from the dead so that one day life gets the final say over all of it. Then draw their hearts to you. And for the rest of us, God, make us bold enough even to be honest, and bold enough to keep going. In Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.